Thank you.
And then you guys are good.
Yeah.
Once everyone gets it done. Sorry. Just,
So, yeah, a full warning, my Wi-Fi is terrible. And there's been multiple rounds here where I just haven't been getting emails. So if that happens,
we'll figure something out,
we've done like AirDrop before or the speech dog share.
but if that takes too long.
Yeah, since this is our speech, I'm gonna give my computer a little bit of time to edit it, but
Yeah.
No, yeah, we're chill with that. Yeah, that's cool.
Okay, so I can just start, right?
yeah, you're fine.
Okay, is anyone not ready? I'll begin on my first word. We affirm resolve, the United States federal government should substantially increase its investment in domestic nuclear energy. Contention one is space. Nuclear energy is key to space colonization, but more investment is needed. Win 20. Nuclear provides uninterrupted electricity, powering systems that keep astronauts alive, crucial in preparing for trips to Mars. On Mars, solar panels struggle to collect light. Nuclear holds the potential to provide power for a space settlement. The goal is to develop a new nuclear fission system for space. 4 of these reactors can provide power to live on Mars. Design is lightweight enough for space and safe. Reactors will depend on sufficient funding. Furthermore, fusion advancements are the single most important emerging technology for space colonization. David 22. Fusion accelerates particles producing loads of energy. Fusion is achievable and fusion gives us the ability to leave our solar system. But investors are required for the development of fusion. Winrich 23. Investors are key. They have the potential to accelerate fusion. Financing risk is the biggest risk to fusion, so investors are critical to success. Funding fusion is challenging, involving high upfront costs. Investors need gut support and certainty. But current funding is insufficient. Disregard doubt in fusion. Any risk that we prove federal investment is enough to make fusion possible and faster means it's try or die. Rich 2025. Scientists have proven fusion is possible. Recent tech breakthroughs secure America's position, yet achieving fusion will require U.S. investment. Now, upfront investment solves challenges and unlocks fusion. And investment secures fusion propulsion deployment by 2030. Crisco 25. Fusion could one day cut the journey of a potential mission to Mars in half. Fusion releases 4 million times more energy than fossil fuels. The first functional will be ready 4 to 5 years later, provided the necessary funding is secured. Fusion propulsion could provide the means to deploy an entire lunar-based crew in a single mission. It would outperform existing propulsion technologies dramatically. And U.S. progress specifically is crucial. Harrison 24. The U.S. is leading the space age. It compromised 81% of launch capacity, 4 times the rest of the world combined. And this access to space is key to solving inevitable extinction. Multiple scenarios. COVID-21 concludes. Space call mitigates extinction. A giant asteroid or meteor, global nuke war, catastrophic global warming, or uncontrollable AI. As humankind develops, the number of existential risks is likely to increase. Cumulative probability is non-trivial. Space call increases the probability of avoiding the worst. Contention 2 is climate. SMR development is being hampered by lack of investment. Will lead 25. Small modular reactors, or SMRs, are the future of clean energy. The high cost and lack of investment slow progress. Only 2 have been designed and put into commercial operation. They take up a fraction of the space required by wind and solar farms. They are designed with passive safety features. But climate change is worsening. Most recent studies confirm we're on the brink of irreversibility, and the next 20 years are key. Gini 25. New studies indicate we have already crossed a key threshold. Beyond this, critical tipping points will be breached, leading to irreversible consequences. Fortunately, nuclear energy offers an effective solution. Hansen 13 confirms. Global nuclear power has prevented 1.84 million air pollution deaths and 64 gigatons of greenhouse gas emissions that would have resulted from fossil fuel burning. And nuclear energy is key for climate goals. Matthew 22 continues. Plants produce no emissions during operation, comparable with wind and 1/3 of solar. Plants can replace fossil fuel. Nuclear power is reducing CO2 by 2 gigatons per year. Nuclear has compensated CO2 with 2 years of CO2 emissions. And transition now solves before the brink. Statements 21. Transition is less costly if we take action urgently. The longer we delay, the larger adjustments will be, and the greater the economic disruption that make '08 look like child's play. We need to employ investments that will enable us to deal with risks that have rightly been called existential. And this is crucial, as failure to address climate change is existential. Spectre 19. Climate change poses an existential threat to human civilization. With governments ignoring the advice of scientists, by 2050, the planet plunges into hotter, deadlier conditions. 55% of the global population are subject to lethal heat conditions, droughts, floods, and wildfires regularly ravage the land. Entire ecosystems collapse. Armed conflicts over resources culminating in nuclear war are likely. The human race has 1 decade left. Thus, we urge you to.
Okay, everyone gets that also.
Is any of it the same or do we have to?
The first one is the same, the second one's.
Okay.
It also
And
switched
we
out
also,
some part.
yeah, I will let you know, okay,
So
if you need to.
We haven't read any of this, so it's like new.
Yeah.
Okay, so we will do this. Did you get the original emoji?
The first one mentions like completely the same.
Okay, I just got that. I'll, yeah.
Okay, I got it.
Oh, yeah, we trust you, we have
Yeah,
not
it's
signed
fine.
it's chill, don't worry about it.
Okay, hold on. All right, I got it, you can get started. Okay, time will start my first word. 3, 2, 1, go. We negate. Convention 1 is private investment. First, private investment ensures a nuclear transition now. Heckler 25 writes that energy demand is not slowing down anytime soon, and the desire for clean energy is opening up a nuclear renaissance. Private equity reached $783.3 million in 2024, 13 times the 23 total. That's a significant spike in funding that emphasizes the desire to adopt and shows how private equity is going to be a catalyst. Second, banks and tech are financing. Quiz 24 writes that in a major shift, private sector, particularly the tech industry, is making significant investments in nuclear energy. Microsoft, Google, and Amazon agreed to purchase SMRs. The biggest signal was 14 major banks expressing their support to triple. Third, current private investment is sufficient. Additional government investment produces less reliable energy. Leave out 24. Partnership through private investment demonstrates not needing subsidies for nuclear power. The market will deliver reliable, affordable, and clean power, far better than government central planning. Current policy trends toward government-forced handouts, disrupt price signals, and flood with unreliable sources, such pay more for less reliable energy. Fourth, government investment picks losers. Lesser 23 finds that over the last half-century, US's track record of selecting winning energy technologies has been a dismal failure. Current policies will be no different. Federal spending on renewable itself is insufficient. Rewarding low-quality resources. Subsidies for these low-quality resources then crowd out spending on higher-quality ones by distorting competitive markets and raising energy prices. Policymakers ignore economic principles in favor of political expediency. Finally, this ensures nuclear industry collapse. Lesser 23 finds that subsidies distort energy markets. They crowd out more productive private investment and reduce the resources available for more efficient forms of nuclear power, especially small modular reactors. Eventually, spending on costly but low value green energy will collapse, and the United States will pay. Our second contention is inflation. First, inflation is down in March. Bureau of Labor Statistics April 10th found that CPI-U decreased 0.1 on a seasonally adjusted basis in March, after rising 0.2 in February. Energy fell 2.4%, and the food rose 0.4. Second, spending on nuclear energy significantly increases inflation rates. Zhang 24 finds that hardly any studies analyze the direct relationship between renewable energy and inflation. However, DECA and DUBE took these variables as control and found a significant positive relationship between the renewable and the inflation, which shows that production and consumption of renewable energy tends to increase prices. Third, federal investment increases inflation. Last year 23. Given the country's deficit, federal green energy subsidies are financed with additional debt. Financing costs alone will be huge and lead to increase in interest rates, crowd out more private investment. Eventually, prolific spending will collapse. Fourth, federal nuclear investment will cost trillions. Paris on COVID-24. US pledged to triple nuclear energy. Terry Biden's climate envoy said there are trillions of dollars available for investment. Fifth, this increases inflation by 20% over 3 years. Beach 24. Government borrowed heavily in 2020 and 2021, fueled the rise in prices by 19.7% in just 3 years, adding up trillions of deficit dollars. Alternative explanations of inflation fail, and history and recent events point clearly to a powerful nexus between excessive deficit spending and rapid increasing prices. Seventh, this decreases life expectancy by 0.66%. Bao Wishang's writes that inflation decline affordability reduces the well-being. GMM solves endogenicity, and 1% increase in inflation reduces life expectancy by 0.033%. Eight, that's half a year on average for every American. Macro trends 2025, current life expectancy for US in 2025 is 79.4 years. And finally, preferred life expectancy that's framed in European Commission online.
Did you end up reading the last, like, are you cutting the last card or?
Yeah.
Okay, so the death expectancy,
Yeah, we're good to get that one.
okay, so you end on macro trends 25.
Yeah.
Yeah, as first speaker, can I get the first question? Sure. Okay, so let's talk about inflation, right? Actually, you know what, let's go to private investment,
Okay.
right? So have we seen the renewables industry, not nuclear, the renewables industry collapse?
So we're saying now when
So, I'm so sorry, could I just have a simple answer to that?
okay, no.
Okay, no. So your link card, right, that says that the government investment picks losers is not specific to nuclear, it's specific to renewables. If we've seen that the government investment has picked losers, but then in renewables, but renewables are still existing, how does that apply to nuclear?
Okay, so
Why does nuclear collapse?
yeah, so what we're saying is specifically for the nuclear industry, it's very like specific to that. When we invest in the nuclear industry, we crowd out the private investment by picking less less quality energy. The government is automatically going to pick the cheaper alternative. That's how they've done it in the past.
Okay, you can take a question.
Okay, yeah. So on your contention about space colonization,
Yeah.
you talk about how nuclear energy is key, but what is the link?
What do you mean, what is the
Like,
link?
how
Oh,
do you get from nuclear energy to space?
well, right now, there are two like main, there's fission and fusion, right? Both of those don't have a ton of investment. Specifically, fusion gives us enough power to be able to power spaceships much faster, bring resources to the moon, also power things, or Mars, and also power things once we're in outer space, right? So the problem is that all of those technologies are in very early development stages. But if we invest more in nuclear, then we can develop them enough to be able to do that. Can I take a question?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so let's talk about like your inflation contention, right? You say that nuclear will cost trillions,
Mhm.
right? Okay. Also, like, does the card actually say that nuclear will cost trillions? Because I don't see that in there.
Okay, so what the Biden's climate envoy was saying was that there are trillions of dollars available for spending, and the United States pledged to triple, which is saying that the United States pledged to like spend a bunch of money on nuclear, and when you substantially increase nuclear, we have all of this money available and it will cost that.
Okay, you can do the question.
Okay, yeah, so on your climate contention, you talk about how SMR development is hampered, but aren't SMRs worse?
What do you mean?
Or like for like the climate?
No, they don't, they're carbon neutral. So no, but
They're not.
even if you were trying to say that SMRs are worse right now, we'd say that the best way to fix that is to invest and to make them better.
Okay, so, okay, yeah,
Okay, let's talk about your contention one of private investment, right?
Yeah.
So where, do you have a card saying that the amount that we're investing in nuclear right now is enough to achieve climate goals for space?
yeah, so what we're saying in our first card in Heckler 25 is that the energy demand right now, we are investing substantially in nuclear.
Prep time?
start, and you guys want a speech doc, right?
Yes, please.
I'm gonna put analytics in just because I have it all here together, so. Also gonna be speaking from the phone a little bit, so. That's not.
No, that's true. I think
You should do that. Yeah. I got it. Okay, awesome. It's just gonna go down there. Ready?
Oh, wait, I didn't, but I guess it doesn't matter as much.
Okay, I'll go first word. Starting with their first contention of private investment. First of all, you can prefer evidence that investment is not enough, private investment. Number one, their evidence does not say current investment is enough to actually accomplish anything, just that it's getting higher in the previous years. Never once does it argue that even at its maximum, private investment could accomplish anything and have any achievements in climate change prevention. But secondly, prefer our three pieces of evidence that currently funding isn't enough from a US senator, a plasma physicist, and a journalist with a PhD in organic chemistry and BS in physics, compared to their LinkedIn post that they're using for their uniqueness to argue that private investment would be enough. But if that's still not enough, here is another piece of evidence. Private investment isn't enough. Tyrone 24. The next generation of nuclear reactors will need to be financed by taxpayers because private investors aren't willing to bear the risks associated with building new plants. That was the warning from bankers at a meeting of industry and government officials in Prague this week. Billion-dollar projects are spooking investors. No private investor wants to take on construction risks, said a financer at Cambridge Nuclear Energy Center. There's a vast need for state involvement, said Marcin Kamiński, risk manager building Poland's first reactors. So you know that private investment has been thought of by some of the greatest nuclear thinking minds in the world, and all of them conclude the government is needed to make any achievement. Secondly, their lesser 23 evidence that they use to argue government subsidies collapse the market concludes that nuclear investment is good. The exact opposite of what our opponents are saying. Let's read that part of that card that our opponents do not highlight. However, given rising US deficits, much if not all of tax credit for green energy, especially wind and solar, will be financed with additional debt. Based on the administration's estimates of the amounts of wind and solar capacity needed to reach that goal, the investment tax credit (ITC) subsidies will total over $1 trillion. Production tax credits for the wind generation will add hundreds of billions more to these totals. The subsidies will further distort energy markets. They will crowd out more productive and reduce investment and reduce the resources available for more efficient forms of generation, such as nuclear power, especially SMRs. What this card is actually saying is that solar and wind renewables are crowding out nuclear investment. Never once does it say that nuclear investment and nuclear subsidies crowd out anything else. That simply is not what the card says. Going on to interest rates, their contention 2. They use lesser 23 to argue that nuclear power crowds out the market. Again, let's read parts of this card that they don't preview. Federal spending on renewable energy itself is inefficient, rewarding low-quality resources such as wind and solar rather than high-quality ones such as nuclear power. The subsidies for these low-quality resources then crowd out spending on higher-quality ones. Our opponents literally tell you in cross that nuclear is the low-quality resource, though in their own evidence says it's the high-quality resource. They do use other cards such as Zane 24 to argue the same thing, but these are blanket statements about renewables, which include solar and wind, based on the conclusion of their other author, Lesser. These are likely the kinds of energy this evidence is referring to. Also, they tell us that because the government would have to create money to fund nuclear investment, this would cause inflation. Let's read the Periscope 24 evidence that they use to argue this. Biden's climate envoy says there are trillions of dollars available that could be used for investment in nuclear energy. Not only does this not argue that investment costs trillions, but it says that even if it did, we would have the money available. It never argues the government would have to create more money. It argues we already have it. Thus we affirm.
Back down.
You already started it.
Okay.
That's 135 years. Bring it down. Okay, I'm now going to send out the speech off. Do you guys mind if it's in a Word doc or do you prefer PDF?
It doesn't matter.
Okay, then I'm gonna send it out as a Word doc. Cool. It's that. By the way, I don't have the analytics for our case because I'm like frontlining the top of my head, but the cards I'm reading and everything else in your case is there.
Okay, wait, let me make sure this.
Come on 1 second.
Okay, yeah, sure.
Hold up.
Now begin. My first word. First one, our case, the investment advantage. They say that private investment is not enough. However, this is wrong. Right now, it is increasing. However, when you invest through the government, they will pick the cheaper options and it will stop the increase of private investment. And remember, we never said that nuclear here is exactly bad. We're saying nuclear is good, but only through private investment. Now, they say that no private investor wants to take on the risks. However, that is exactly the point. Private investors are better than the government because they care about building quality reactors. When the government is pushing ahead with the SMRs as they're saying the government wants to build, they know they're not safe and they do not want to risk it. They want these regulations in place to ensure that these nuclear reactors will work. In addition, we could still talk about Lesser 23. Our card is really good that says that the government has always picked losers in the past. They try to give you re-highlighting, but this still flows towards our side, especially when it says that the only reason they picked these other sources is because they are cheaper. The moment that SMRs are cheaper because they are more risky and dangerous, the government will pick it and this will cause meltdowns and other accidents in the future. Now, then they critique our DOM 24 card. However, this is wrong. It specifies non-fossil fuel alternatives, which obviously includes nuclear energy. You should prefer this evidence over their analytics. It's a research paper done on the topic. In addition, we tell you the card is talking about how it's specific to the US and also includes statistics from countries all across the world that are nuclear leaders right now. Okay, let's go on to interest rates. First, that what they said here is not what we're saying. As he said, cross-apply from above, where he said the government will pick the cheaper option. We never said nuclear is bad. In addition, yes, the trillions that Biden is talking about is in deficit spending. That's how budget works. And DOM 24 also says specific wording in the text of it that is low carbon. So we know that these trillions of dollars do not exist right now, but they will the moment you pass the plan. Now let's go into my opponent's case. First, they talk about space. Judge, you know there is no way this is happening, but we'll still read evidence. Mars colonization is impossible for 200 years. Sony 23 says that space exploration scientists told an interview that the colonization of Mars is practically impossible at least for 200 years. Humans on Mars would be completely unprotected in the event of a solar explosion due to the lack of magnetic fields and an atmosphere. Humans would need shelters dug at least 1 meter underground. But also, colonization fails for dozens of reasons. You need 20. Solar expansion is very improbable, too difficult and expensive, pathogens evolve, ecosystems too difficult, people may not want to live on Mars, a colony might succumb, the sponsor might abandon due to priorities, resources, or conflicts. Assumption that space will be propelled by numerous agents committed to humanity is dubious. A long list of powerful barriers stand between colonization. It is imprudent to view colonization as a hedge against extinction. Let's go on to the climate advantage. First, nuclear energy cannot solve the climate. Haywood 23. Evidence base for these initiatives is poor. Investments in nuclear power are bad for the climate due to high costs and long construction times. Nuclear reactors are the investment type with the most frequent and largest cost overruns. 97% of the 180 nuclear reactor investment projects suffered cost overruns with an average 117% per project. Nuclear is not entirely reliable. Climate change increase, extreme heat, low river flows, and problems with cooling nuclear power plants. Ramping up a nuclear power plant is slow. Cost composition does not fit the rule of backup technology. Building nuclear plants is slow and delivery is uncertain. Assume construction times around 1 decade. Renewables can come online in a fraction of that time. Nuclear plants takes years of planning. Construction is costly while the climate crisis demands urgency and large investments that cost efficiency. The key importance. Relying on nuclear to achieve climate targets is impossible. In addition, nuclear construction and mining increase short-term CO2 emissions. Lu 23. Nuclear power is not carbon-free. Emissions from construction and operation are underestimated. Total emissions from vegetation loss, equipment manufacturing. Mark the card at equipment manufacturing. That is the last line, halfway through. Are you good with that or do you want to mark on? It's just that line. It's fine.
Yeah.
Are you good? Okay, great.
Okay, so when you were responding to our first contention of private investment, or your first contention of private investment, where we talked about solar and wind subsidies being what we're starting out in the market. You said that when SMRs become cheaper, that's what the government picks, and those are dangerous because they cause meltdowns.
There's meltdowns and also yeah, sure. So the SMRs are cheap and that's why the government is investing in them. In addition, because there's deregulation now and the government is pushing for these, they're trying to build them as fast as possible.
Right.
There's definitely gonna cut corners everywhere, which is gonna cause meltdowns and other issues.
Okay, I'm sorry. I didn't hear anything about deregulation in your case. Are you talking about like defunding of the NRC? Like,
No, the government already has deregulation right now, but we don't need to.
so
go to that.
deregulation to the point where meltdowns would become possible?
No, it's not only deregulation. Like uniquely, there are deregulations now which emphasize this impact, but also it's that the government is trying to put as little spending as possible, so they're not going to buy the most quality components. right?
Right,
They're
but if
trying
they
to
have
speed it up.
less money, would that not make them more driven to buy cheaper components?
We're saying, yes, they are buying cheap components now, which is bad.
Right,
for
they're
the
buying
quality.
cheap components now, why does that worsen when they get more money?
Yes,
They're
because,
given more money to spend, so they buy cheaper and cheaper things.
no, but they also decided to spend it on SMRs, which are dangerous and not good, while private investors now are not gonna be cutting corners like the government. Even
Okay.
if they're cheaper now, this is actually an emphasis on the impact. They're not gonna spend it to build more quality ones, they're gonna spend it to build even more of SMRs, which is gonna be even worse for the
Right, but I
environment. We
still
all
don't
know
get your
that.
link into meltdowns.
It doesn't need to link into meltdowns, because as our card specifies, it's not only meltdowns, but it's also gonna cause increased environmental and climate issues, because they're not gonna probably dispose of the waste
Okay.
or other
Okay.
issues we'll have to do construction.
You can take the question.
Yeah. Sure, so let's go on to when you talk about for space, could you explain how? I wanna understand, so you're saying that nuclear is key to fusion or fission reactors, correct? So once you arrive on space, how do you know colonization will be possible?
Okay, so what we frame it as is it's try or die, yeah, right? Because in our space contention, we talk about how extinction on planet Earth is going to happen at some point, right? It's not a an infinite resource, right? It's a
So what's
finite
the
resource.
time frame?
Right, so the timeframe. Okay, first of all, the investment into SMRs means that investment into nuclear means that fusion technology would exist 4 to 5 years after the investment happens. The time frame is as soon as humanly possible, because if it's try or die, and if it's going to happen at some point, you wanna have the solution as quickly as
Wait, I wanna ask, what extinction scenario is happening this year?
Right, so we read you 2 extinction scenarios. Not only do, and you read this as well, you say that climate change is, right, climate change is going to, if nothing is done about it, it's going to kill the human race, right?
Okay, and
So, that's wrong.
yeah, that's good, that's good.
We're gonna. We're gonna take prep time. Starting now. It's an off-time roadmap, it'll be our case there, he's waiting. So, and then no new builds. Cool. Yeah. Is anyone not ready? Okay. I'll begin on my first one. Okay. On our contention to climate, right now, nuclear development is being hampered by lack of investment. Climate change is worsening. We're on the brink of irreversibility and we have to act as soon as possible. Fortunately, nuclear has been proven as preventing millions of deaths from fossil fuels and gigatons of greenhouse gases. We just need more. As failure to address climate change is existential. Let's talk about their answer to our case. Let's go on to, we'll concede that Mars colonization is impossible. Let's go on to climate. They say that nuclear can't solve because it costs too much. Exactly, we need more investment because it's expensive, and we've seen it work in the past. But then also they say that long construction, construction takes too much time. But remember, we're arguing for SMRs because they can be built much faster. But then also we'd say that increased investment means that we can produce more quicker. But then they say that construction increases short-term emissions. First of all, the keyword there is short-term. And then second, they can see that empirically, overall emissions went down with an increase of nuclear. That is one of the most key pieces of evidence in the round, because you know that when this actually happened in real life, emissions went down overall. But then let's go on to their case. They say that investment is increasing. One, it's still not enough. We see that we're still moving towards the brink of climate irreversibility. And then two, prefer our four qualified authors saying it's not enough to help. Remember, their uniqueness is from a LinkedIn post. But then they say that private investors care about building quality reactors. The government does too. It would be a political nightmare if something happened with the reactors that the government is building. They want safe reactors too. But then they say that the government has picked losers in the past. Once again, these cards are talking about renewables, not necessarily nuclear. And if this were true that it leads to collapse, then the renewables sector should have crashed as well. But then they say that SMRs are dangerous. Once again, even if this is true, investment is needed to make them better and improve them. Then they say that the government will pick cheaper options. They will no longer need to do that if they have more to spend. The app makes that better. And then they say that the Biden example is trillions of dollars in deficit spending. No, it says that there are trillions of dollars available to invest. But then let's remember answers. Remember, on their contention one, prefer four cards from qualified journalists and scientists to their LinkedIn post. Private investment isn't enough. And then two, their Lusher 23 evidence they used to argue government subsidies collapse the market concludes that nuclear investment is better than alternatives. And then on their contention two, these are blanket statements about renewables, which include solar and wind. If this were true, we should have seen their collapse as well. And then also their own evidence says that the government has trillions of dollars available for investment, and it doesn't say that nuclear would even cost trillions of dollars in the first place. We outweigh on magnitude. Extinction has infinite magnitudes, as it's killing not just the current generation, but all the possible future ones, whereas the net impacts out to a few million deaths. And then prefer magnitude over time frame. If the priority is saving the most lives, then you're going to prioritize more lives later than fewer sooner. It's going to go with the app.
Yeah,
What is it again?
Oh, weighing Arctic staircase.
Okay.
Okay, time to start my first story. 3, 2, 1, go. Extend inflation, the most important impact in this round. Federal nuclear investment will cost trillions and will be financed through deficit spending, pumping excess money into the economy, which will reignite inflation by 20% over 3 years. We have way on probability because 20% inflation would take half a year off of a few hundred American lives. Prefer because life expectancy accounts for years lost due to debts, which are accounts for impacts that disproportionately affect young. Judge, over the past 5 years, there has been mass hysteria over prices. You can see that this will happen again when we spend trillions of funding in deficit spending on nuclear energy. It's way too much and will harm the economy. And you can also see we outlay on time frame because when you invest in nuclear energy, we automatically use the deficit spending to fund this. On our case, they say it's blanket statements, but our evidence says the government uses deficit spending to fund nuclear energy. It's specifically to how we're going to take this money out and put it into nuclear energy. And then the text of the card uses words like low carbon. This is where they make a mistake. Our Zhang 24 evidence is specific, and it's a research paper about how when you invest in any energy, it increases inflation. They make a big mistake by agreeing with us that in the short term, this development will result in much bigger emissions, especially when they're trying to go for climate. In the time that it takes to build all these reactors, which will take years, the huge amount of emissions produced will trigger climate immediately, which means they will never be able to solve. Therefore, the only impact we can vote for is neg, because we save by reducing time frame, which happens the moment you vote neg. Prefer probability time plus time frame over magnitude. On their case, on their climate, nuclear cannot solve the climate. Extend Haywood 23, where we find how nuclear is extremely expensive and will take long time periods. Even if they use SMRs, we've already proven across that it's a bad idea. The government will cut corners. The government won't solve the issue, and as above, they will increase pollution. When the government invests in these, they will pick the lower cost alternative. They talk about how if we have more money, we won't, but the government will focus on spending more, making more new reactors. They agree that increased investments make more nuclear cheaper. This shows how investment is going to become cheaper, doesn't make it better. It will make more increased emissions, not increasing the quality. It doesn't change anything. Now, let me tell you why we automatically win this debate. So first on the weighing, because you have to prefer probability and time frame over magnitude. We have a high probability as it's happening and time frame because it will happen immediately when you invest in nuclear energy. Under magnitude, they have no they take a long time frame for their impact, which means they cannot solve because the amount of emissions used when you create these nuclear plants is outweighing their entire impact. So therefore, it hurts me. No, are you guys?
Okay, as first speaker, can I take the first question?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about like this whole thing that the government will cut corners, right? So like, given that that example is talking about renewables, why haven't we seen the collapse of the renewables industry if the government is supposedly cutting corners?
Okay, so when we say that when you invest so much money into the nuclear industry, the government is going to want to build as many as possible. They're not going to want to use the most high quality, so they're going to invest in the cheaper alternative.
Wait, how do you know that?
When we're saying, you agree like the government's going to spend make as many SMRs, right?
How do you know that the government is going to make as many as possible?
You
Because
said
it's
that
like
you
every-
said that.
And cut corners.
Because we're saying they're gonna cut corners, because if they wanna make as many as possible.
Right.
They're gonna pick the cheaper
But
option.
how do you know that?
That's how government spending works, government always picks. the
What
cheaper
tells
option.
you that?
Like, what evidence do you?
That's evidence to that. Yeah.
Right, but what historically or
No,
what
sure.
analysis tells you that the government would cut corners?
Yeah, sure. So you tried to green highlight our card and saying that they're picking other renewables over nuclear. But the warranty they give for that is they picked it because it was cheaper. So if you have a cheaper option, which in this case is SMRs versus larger nuclear reactors, then obviously they're gonna pick that and make it as fast as they can. It's not gonna be
Okay,
good.
but I still don't get how you access that those SMRs would not be good, because I do understand that they're picking cheaper options. But why does that cheaper option have to be low quality?
Okay, so cheaper options are inherently low quality, so like when you go for like a cheaper like if you like take your life for example, if you like choose a cheaper option, it's going to be lower quality than an extremely high end option. And they're gonna choose cheaper options so they can build more of that, that's what we're telling you.
You also conceded it in cross when you specified that when the government gets more money, they're just gonna build more SMRs.
Wait, that's not the same thing. right?
Yes,
Like,
because
no, we're
talking
saying,
about, you can go.
what we said in cross is that if the government gets more money, then they won't need to cut corners.
Okay,
That's actually
That's
what we're
not,
talking
yeah,
about.
that's what we said.
but you are telling us that they're gonna build as many as possible, so if
Wait.
to build as many.
I
That we never said,
don't
when
remember
did we
saying
say
that.
that?
That was
We-
yours.
That was in our.
You didn't say build as many as possible.
We
So
just
how
said
many
that they
are we
won't
building?
need to cut corners because they'll have more money.
So they're building,
The government like is going to pick the cheaper option, right? Because
Right.
They won't need,
Right, okay, but SMRs are still inherently better than the renewables that they're picking now, so I don't get why picking SMRs, because they become cheaper, even though they are better than what they're picking now, is a bad thing.
no, your evidence says that nuclear as a whole is better.
Yeah,
And we're
Yes,
saying
SMRs
yes.
are nuclear.
Yes,
And so
SMRs
does
are
your
nuclear.
evidence, your
Yes.
evidence also says that.
Yes, and we're saying we don't want SMRs, because current private investment is in the good nuclear.
Wait,
there is no private investment,
There is
not
private
there's very minimal private investment.
well,
But
it's
it's
not enough, no,
It's
the
not.
private investment in SMRs is enough for 2 SMRs to have been created.
Okay, we have, we coached a minute 32, so I'm gonna say we have a minute 28 left. Let's take it starting now.
Right.
So I'm gonna start briefly on their case, and then I'm gonna move on to our own case, and I'm going to weigh the graph. Everybody ready? In their case, first and foremost, they don't fully extend their contentions, but let's go to their contention two. They make blanket statements about renewables, which includes solar and wind. Again, if it were true that investment into renewables would cause a collapse, we should have seen a collapse when we invested in solar and wind. Their own evidence disproves themselves. Also, they say that their own evidence says that the government has trillions of dollars to spend, not that they would have to create trillions of dollars. Read the evidence, read the Periscope evidence, it says they have trillions of dollars available. The more money they have, the less corners they need to cut. Our opponents make assumptions about cost and quality, but their evidence themselves refutes it. But that's not even the most important part. Let's move on to our own case. On contention to climate. Right now, nuclear development is being hampered by lack of investment. Climate change is worsening. We're on the brink of irreversibility, and we have to act as soon as possible. Fortunately, nuclear has been proven as preventing millions of deaths from fossil fuel and gigatons of greenhouse gases. We just need more, as failure to address climate change is existential. Our opponents never refute our impact scenario, so you know when evaluating this round that in a NED world, extinction is ensured. Our opponents argue no way of solving it in their world. All of their answers ignore that despite all of this, nuclear is the best option we have. We explained that not only is nuclear better in comparison to alternatives, as seen in it resulted in long-term less emission where it was implemented, our opponents also only argue short-term negatives to nuclear power. Even if you give them all of these answers, you know at best they access short-term negative impacts versus the long-term benefits we've proven. Empirically, it's proven. Going on to weighing. It's try or die for the affirmative. You can buy every risk from SMRs, every local emission from plants claim, but you know regardless of that, the climate brink is coming. If we do nothing about it, extinction is ensured. Even if you give them in their entire link scenario, their impact pales in comparison to our untouched existentialism impact. At most, they access a fraction of the United States population. We outweigh on preferred probability because you need to vote on what you are sure is actually going to happen versus something that has a hypothetical low probability. You're voting on what's ensured. Thus, we affirm.
Okay. You don't have prep, so I'm gonna go over. Okay. The order is going to be starting with weighing, and I'm going to go over our case, and then I'm going to go to my opponent's case. Starting time on my first one. Extend inflation, which is the most important impact in this round. Federal nuclear investment will cost trillions and will be financed through deficits. The only answer they have here is the card says that we have trillions. No, have is the money we have in deficits. That's how the government has always paid for these nuclear things, as we've extended throughout the entire round, and they were just ignoring empirics, which means you could definitely give this to us. Now that you know they're investing in trillions, let's see what will happen. Pumping excess money into the economy will reignite inflation by 20% over 3 years. Our evidence is specific to our scenario. You can vote for us on probability right here, because 20% inflation would take half a year off from a few 100 million American lives. You should prefer this because life expectancy accounts for years lost due to death, which accounts for impacts that disproportionately affect the young. Judge, over the past 5 years, there has been mass hysteria over prices and inflation. You want to increase inflation even more until living is unbearable. This is horrible. Now, let's look at their case. There's a double bind in a lose-lose situation. One, they build enough SMRs to solve for climate change, which will also cause huge short-term emissions during their construction that they themselves agreed with. Now, as we said, these short-term emissions is going to trigger climate change even faster, which means they will never solve for it. This goes unresponded to. It was in the summary. Two, they don't build enough SMRs. And guess what? Then they still cannot solve for climate because they don't reduce emissions by enough. Already, there is no path to victory for them. You cannot give them the climate scenario when there's a 0% of a link. And as we said, they did no impact comparison. You know you should prefer probability and time frame because it's going to happen immediately, and they can't solve for climate when they themselves said climate is a short-term impact. If climate is a short-term impact, how the hell can they go for a long-term solution to a short-term impact when extinction is going to trigger right away? In addition, you cannot vote for them because the government will always go the cheaper route, which is low quality and bad for the climate, which means that you already know these SMRs are not going to be the quality needed to solve for this climate contention. And as we said, we're the only one who did clear weighing throughout the round. You can vote for us here. Thank you. Good debate. Good debate.